Good morning, everybody. We have a record crowd today, so I will not take too much of your time to make an opening introduction. I'm Nancy Prager-Camel, Chairman of the Board of the Association of Foreign Correspondents, which the panel is being hosted by us and also, excuse me, by the National Press Foundation. So we thank Sunny Efron for her partnership, and we are being sponsored by Bayer. As a former UNESCO National Commissioner, I do confirm the very basic premise that this conversation offers as we follow the very compelling thread that climate change and detrimental land management creates drought, which ruins crops, which in turn creates famine, which necessitates migration. Therefore, the victims of this environmental disaster become displaced refugees, and as vulnerable populations, they're subject to revile and rejection. Fast forward to the pandemic, as we regard the danger of further acceleration and marginalization. What steps must we take due to this added disruption to seek answers and pandemic lessons desperately needed to improve our food distribution and security? Will the pandemic accelerate or slow patterns of agricultural change over the next decade? What has been learned from the supply chain disruption and problems with visa and health status of migrant workers in the United States, Europe, and around the world? Can pandemic lessons be incorporated into planning to improve food security and resilience? We give sincere appreciation to Bayer, our first and greatly valued sponsor who truly supports the work of the AFC with programs like this. They also sponsor our scholarship awards, and a former recipient will be moderating this very panel today. We value Bayer's commitment with no expectation from us and zero strings attached, while they honor our independent integrity. I turn this over to Ohena Bob. It's your show now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Hello and welcome to everyone for joining us online today. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to moderate this session. I will briefly introduce our distinguished panel here, and then we'll jump right in. We have the honor today of having Laura Reiley, a veteran food journalist and the business of food reporter at the Washington Post. Laura is an author, and in 2017, she was a Pulitzer and James Beard finalist. Laura, we're very pleased to have you. We also have with us Dr. Willett, who is professor of epidemiology and nutrition at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health and professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Professor Willett also served as chair of the Department of Nutrition at Harvard for a good 25 years. And we have Professor Schrag, who is also a professor of geology at Harvard University and director of the Harvard University Center for the Environment. He also co-directs the program on science, technology, and public policy at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you all very much for making the time today, and welcome. We'll kick things off with Professor Willett giving us a presentation on food.
I'm going to give a very quick overview of how our dietary choices, our dietary patterns relate to both personal and planetary health. A lot of the work that I'm going to be doing is based on the Eat Lancet Commission that I co-chaired with Johan Rockström. This was supported by the Wellcome Trust and allowed us to bring together 35 scientists from 17 different countries around the world to look at a great challenge. Specifically, how can we feed what will be about 9.8 billion people in 2050 a diet that is both healthy and sustainable? The standard response has been that we just need to increase grain production massively by about 70% to feed to animals that people will want to consume. That's been called a business as usual model. The scale of the challenge we face is huge. We have about 2 billion people today who still lack key micronutrients. We have millions of stunted children, and about 2 billion adults are overweight or obese, and that number is increasing dramatically. Beyond that, diet quality is far from optimal in all countries, and that has major implications for non-communicable disease risk. This problem of this epidemic of obesity is indeed global. This shows on top the lines for men and women in developed countries, and you can see a steady increase in rates of obesity. We're up to about 42% prevalence in the United States now. The bottom lines are for low-income countries, and the rate of increase is actually greater in those countries. So there's almost no country that's been immune from this epidemic that has huge consequences. Climate change is, I put this slide here for the last 4 years that it's not a hoax. I think maybe we don't need to keep reminding people it's not a hoax anymore. Dr. Schrag can show you lots of details, not lots of numbers, that this is real, but you just need to look around the world. And the fact that the Arctic Ocean is opening up, the glaciers are retreating all around the world. The ice cap on Kilimanjaro, I spent some years working in Tanzania in the 1970s. There was always a healthy, thick ice cap. It's almost gone now and will be gone in about 10 years. And most ominously, the Greenland ice cap is melting at a rate about 7 times greater than it was in 1990, which has massive implications for sea level rise. And what's really worrisome is that this increase in global temperature is not linear. It's been accelerating. And you probably heard that here, this showed that 2016 was the highest temperature so far up to that point in time, and we were tied for that last year. So this is this acceleration, nonlinear increase in temperature is what's most worrisome, I find. So how are we going to take on this huge challenge, both on the environmental side and on the health side? This commission that I co-chaired broke this challenge down into 4 steps. 1, defining a healthy reference diet using the best available evidence from all sources. And our colleagues in the earth sciences define planetary boundaries. There are limits beyond which we can't go, and it will be unsustainable. They did this for greenhouse gas production, cropland use, water use, and other variables. And then we, after identifying what would be a healthy dietary pattern, look to see whether that could be produced for everyone on the earth and stay within the planetary boundaries. And we use a modeling framework to do that, and then went on to look at some strategies. To give you a feel of how we looked at defining a healthy diet, we looked at all the major food groups. Here I'm going to focus on major protein sources since they are very important for both health and for environmental implications. First step, we just looked at the composition of different foods. And we all know that beef has a lot of saturated fat. Most people don't appreciate that it also has very little polyunsaturated fat, which is essential and has important health benefits. So that ratio of polyunsaturated to saturated fat, which we've known is very important for decades because that influences blood cholesterol levels. That ratio is very low in beef, much better in chicken, actually, better in salmon. But if you really want a good ratios, you have to go to almonds, tofu, lentils, plant sources of protein, basically. But of course, this isn't enough, that there are lots of other constituents in these products, minerals, vitamins, phytochemicals that could influence health. So we went to the next step, which is basically intervention studies that are randomized, short-term, modest numbers of people feeding different foods and looking at the effects on risk factors. Those show up in a few weeks. You don't have to look at large numbers of people or long-term studies. And here it shows very clearly, if you replace healthy, high-quality plant sources of protein like legumes, nuts, soy products with red meat, you get an increase in LDL cholesterol. So that alone, that's a well-established risk factor for cardiovascular disease. That alone would strongly suggest that going the other way, replacing red meat with these healthy plant sources would be likely to reduce cardiovascular disease. But again, LDL and blood cholesterol fractions are not the only thing. Some colleagues in Germany took this in next step, and they looked at 66 randomized trials of different food groups in what they called a network meta-analysis. And they looked at lipids, measures of blood glucose, blood pressure, and measures of inflammation, and looked at the effects of all of these different food groups on those outcomes, and then added up adverse effects and beneficial effects to create an overall score. Right at the top, nuts were the most healthy, then legumes, whole grains, fish, fruits and vegetables. Then we started to get into things that are less healthy: refined grains, red meat, eggs, dairy, and of course, worst of all, sugar sweetened beverages. So this again would predict that nuts would be beneficial for major disease outcomes, and animal source proteins would be less beneficial. Of course, we really want to look at health outcomes themselves. That's really what we're ultimately interested in. And because foods act by many different metabolic pathways, it is really important to look at the final outcome. So our group has been conducting these large long-term studies going back to 1980, where we're following several 100,000 people now with detailed diet assessments every 4 years, but we keep track of smoking, physical activity, and everything we could think of that might influence cardiovascular disease and other conditions. So we can adjust for those in statistical analyses. And very briefly, we've published thousands of papers from these studies, but when we look at major protein sources, this is how they line up, looking at mortality. Over 30 years, this is tens of thousands of people that died by that time, so we have a lot of statistical precision. The worst being processed meats, then per gram of protein, eggs, unprocessed, in other words, fresh meat, then fish being about equal to dairy. That horizontal line is the comparison here, that's dairy. Then poultry being better than that, but the most, the source of protein most strongly associated with lower mortality was plant sources of protein, which aligns very well with what I just showed you would be concluded by looking just at the short-term studies with intermediate endpoints. So that body of evidence looking at short-term indicators and then long-term disease risk make a very strong case that these are causal relationships. It's hard to study these in randomized trials because they are tens of thousands of people to look at outcomes, and you need to follow people for probably decades. But one trial that came the closest was the Mediterranean diet pattern trial, and they found that basically reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, whether it was Mediterranean diet with added nuts or Mediterranean diet with extra virgin olive oil. Low red meat was part of that, but we can't say specifically that those benefits were due to the low red meat consumption. So we went through this process, literally thousands of studies, dozens of meta-analyses, and to come up with some target numbers for major food groups. And I won't go through all of these in detail, but we have a target number, and we also put in ranges because there is flexibility. For example, whole grains, what's important about grains is that they be whole grains, not refined grains. And there's a lot of flexibility in the amounts because grains aren't actually essential, but a moderate consumption has some health benefits. For dairy, we came up with a range of 1 to 2 servings a day, but pick the midpoint, about 1 glass of milk per day or equivalent. For red meat, we kept those numbers low. That comes to about 1 serving a day. Chicken, other poultry, 2 servings per week. Excuse me, I think the red meat, that was 1 serving per week. I may have misspoken there. Eggs, about 2 eggs per week. Fish, 2 servings per week. They are an important source of omega-3 fatty acids. And emphasizing plant sources of protein like dried beans, lentils, peas, soy, and nuts. And of course, what's important about fat is not the total amount. There's quite a bit of flexibility about that, but the important point is that they be mostly unsaturated fats and low saturated fats, and keeping sugar low. So if we look at the plate, that's going to be about, by volume, half a plate with vegetables, about 2/3 of the protein sources being from animal sources, 2/3 being from plant sources, 1/3 being from animal sources, some whole grains, healthy fats, and low sugar. But it really can boil down to something pretty simple about 2 servings of animal source protein per day, one of them being dairy and the other being some combination of small amounts of red meat, poultry, fish twice a week, and some eggs. So it, in the end, is through lots of analyses and numbers, it does come down to a pretty simple definition. Is this realistic? It turns out that this is very similar to what Greek men were eating in the 1960s, when at that time they had the healthiest life expectancy in the world, and a diet that is the traditional Mediterranean diet that is actually appreciated for its flavor and variety. We ran nutritional analyses on this just to make sure we weren't really out of line in anything. It basically looks good. One point I would flag here is if someone decides to go lower in their protein sources, and the ranges were compatible with being a vegan if you wanted to be a vegan, but we wanted to create lots of flexibility so you didn't have to be. Vitamin B12 can get low if you go below 2 servings of animal source proteins per day. We then looked at what would be the impact on mortality globally if everybody in the world did adopt this diet. And we used 3 different methods that they came out to give quite similar numbers, which gave us confidence that we would prevent around 20 to 24% of deaths annually, which comes out to be about 11 million deaths avoidable annually by that dietary shift. We went on to look at the environmental implications of this diet and some alternative diets using what's called life cycle analysis. That is, these are careful studies looking at the environmental impacts of producing different foods. And what's critical here, the green numbers are greenhouse gas emissions. Red meat, basically beef, way off charts here. Compared to legumes, red meat has about 150 times the greenhouse gas emissions per serving. That's partly because of the very inefficient conversion of grain to meat that people eat, but all the time the animals are alive, because they have fermentation going on in their rumen, they are producing a lot of methane 24/7. Other animal source proteins are lower than red meat, pork, chicken, fish, dairy, eggs, but those are still 20, 30, 50 times higher per serving than for these plant sources of protein. So this clearly says shifting more toward this end of the spectrum of plant sources of protein would have very important impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. We went on to look at where people are around the world, and it varies tremendously by region. Just for example, for red meat, this vertical dotted line here represents our target numbers. We're way over that in North America, but in Southeast Asia, they're actually below that, sub-Saharan Africa about that. So it can't just say eat more or eat less. It really depends on where people are starting. But very importantly, for many food groups, whole grains, legumes, fruit, vegetables, fish, almost all the world is below what would be an optimal diet. So to really have the healthiest diet, it's not just reducing some of these things up here, but it's actually increasing production and consumption of health promoting foods. To put this body of data together, the health impacts and the environmental impacts, we used, as I mentioned earlier, the planetary boundaries concept. It's been estimated that we could sustainably produce about 5 gigatons per year of greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector. And in 2010, we were just about at that number, a little bit over. But if we follow the business as usual model, our current pathway, by 2050, we will be about double the planetary boundary numbers. So clearly, we're on a path to unsustainable food production. But if we adopted the targets that we came up with for a healthy diet, that would bring the number back down to about the planetary boundary. And if we improve production methods and reduce food waste, we could get below that planetary boundary fairly easily. Now, I said easily, it's not that to get there is going to be very hard. And finally, I wanted to put this in perspective a bit. that Dan Schrag is going to talk about overall greenhouse gas emissions. And the food sector is not the largest sector. They're mostly coming from energy, industry, buildings, transportation sector. And I should mention this is the IPCC pathway to staying less than 2 degrees centigrade by 2100. So food consumption, if it stays the same, we could and totally shift to green energy. We could get to the pathway, stay on the path to avoiding excessive global warming. But this is the business as usual model. If we I go on the pathway that we're currently on, we will overshoot the greenhouse gas emission limits substantially. But if we adopt the targets that I mentioned, that could keep us on track. So just to conclude, we are on a path leading to ecological disasters and a sick and unstable global population. But we did find that feeding 10 billion people a healthy and sustainable diet is possible. This would improve the well-being of billions of people and allow us to pass on to our children a viable planet. But I didn't talk about how we get there. This is going to be a huge challenge because we're so far off path at the moment, and it will require the efforts of almost every individual, every sector to achieve this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Willett, for such an insightful presentation. There's so much to unpack there. One thing that you mentioned, you touched on some of the vitamins and nutritional benefits. Vitamin D is one that has been a hot topic during the pandemic. There is some evidence to suggest that it might help protect against getting infected with COVID or even developing serious symptoms. In the UK, for example, last December, there's been new guidance allowing clinically vulnerable people to be able to opt in to receive 4 months supply of vitamin D. So my question is, what is the connection between vitamin D deficiency and COVID? And what are the nutritional benefits present in this vitamin that can help fight the virus?
Right, that's a very important topic. And actually we have a paper coming out just in a couple of weeks on that and the broader impacts of vitamin D. And it's a very big topic because vitamin D has literally thousands of biological effects. It can activate or inactivate thousands of different genes. And it does have a clear effect on immunity. We have seen for other respiratory infections that vitamin D supplements can reduce the severity of disease if people are deficient to start with. Now, if somebody already has enough vitamin D, adding more doesn't necessarily help. But we don't have any direct proof that taking vitamin D supplements will reduce the severity of COVID specifically. We just don't have enough data. There's a handful of studies going on right now that are looking at that. But given the evidence that we have, I think it's reasonable to be sure we're not vitamin D deficient. And this, especially in the wintertime in northern climates, where we're not out in the sun and there's not enough sun to generate vitamin D, even if we do go outside. And now we've been inside more because of COVID, vitamin D levels sink even further. And this is a special issue for people with darker skin because normally, basically we've evolved so that our melanin in our skin balances out the intensity of sunlight. That dark skin's the best skin because it's most protective. But when people moved away from the equator by migration over tens of thousands of years, they became vitamin D deficient, and so evolutionarily we lost our melanin, and but even still, because with people with light skin now work inside, we're not out in the sun, there's still a lot of vitamin D deficiency among all groups of people, but severe deficiency in our analysis was 17 times higher in African Americans compared to European Americans. So this is an issue for everybody, but it's especially important for people with darker skin. So I take my vitamin D. And I would also add that part of this review shows there's lots of other harms of being low in vitamin D, even forgetting about COVID, higher risk of diabetes, higher risk of fatal cancer, probably higher risk of dementia. So even before COVID came along, I was taking a vitamin D, and I think anyone looking at the data seriously would want to make sure that they weren't deficient. And in fact, in the UK, even before COVID, there was a national recommendation to take a vitamin D supplement. So it is an important topic, and especially for people who are already at higher risk because of often crowded conditions, poor work sites, risky occupations. It's not going to solve all of that, but if there's anything we can do to tip the balance in favor, and it's cheap and inexpensive, I think it makes sense to do that.
Thank you so much for those insights, Professor Willett. I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to delve deeper as we move on. I'll hand it over now to Dr. Schrag, who will give us the environmental perspective related to the broader climate change issue.
I really appreciate it. And Walter Willett is a hero of mine. So I've learned so much from him over the years. Food security and global nutrition is one of the great challenges of the world that we just heard about. And it intersects with many other problems, global poverty for sure, conservation in an interesting way. We'll talk a little bit later about tension between conservation efforts and agricultural efforts. But certainly climate change is intertwined, as Walter said just now. I'm a climate scientist and a geologist. I think about climate change, but also about energy systems and energy technology to try to solve the problem. And so what I want to do today, cover that whole territory in 10 minutes is almost impossible. So what I'm going to do is try to give you a very brief overview of what I think is the essence of the climate problem, and then talk about an idea about how to think about what COVID teaches us about that challenge in the years ahead, and how it maybe intersects a little bit with some aspects of the food security and nutrition problem, and maybe gives us a slight bit of reason for hope. Climate change is a super hard problem, not just a hard problem, it's a super hard problem. And the reason, I think, is really for two factors. First of all, climate change is a collective action problem that is global. Humans are really bad at collective action. And what I mean by this is that the atmosphere is global. And the climate system, the ocean, the atmosphere, the ice sheets, they respond to, as best as we can tell, cumulative global emissions of the longest lived greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide. There are also other greenhouse gases that are important, but carbon dioxide is the dominant one. And it has a lifetime of, an incredibly long lifetime. Something like more than 20% of the CO2 we put in the air will still be there thousands of years from now. So the timescales are incredibly long, and it is a global commons. Humans are really not good at collective action. We are tribal, we are nationalistic. The idea of actually tackling a truly global problem like this, in some ways, is unprecedented, and it remains a huge challenge for this century. But the other reason that climate change is a super hard problem is that almost all aspects of climate change have really long timescales. And when I say long timescales, I mean really long timescales. The timescale, for example, of heat uptake of the ocean is thousands of years. Even if we stopped CO2 emissions, the temperature of the ocean would continue to warm for more than 1,000 years because it still isn't in equilibrium. The time scale, and I'll just show you some of these things. Here, for example, is a picture of the spatial pattern of climate change. This is the 5-year average of 2015 to 2019, minus what was happening 100 years earlier. This is sort of an anomaly map relative to a long-term mean. And what you see here is that, first of all, you see that the Arctic has warmed a lot more than the rest of the world. That's called polar amplification, and we have some understanding of that. But we also can see that the land has warmed about twice as much as the ocean. It turns out that's exactly what you expect from the physics of climate change, that the land doesn't have the same heat capacity because it doesn't mix, whereas the oceans mix down by the winds and by the tides, hundreds of meters, and so the oceans are still sucking up huge amounts of heat. Roughly 90% of the energy imbalance caused by the extra greenhouse gases in our atmosphere is actually sucked up by the ocean. That's good news because it means that the oceans are essentially keeping us cold. It's bad news because it means that we have committed the Earth to warming for centuries to millennia. And again, we're not used to dealing with these timescales. Here's a picture of the Greenland ice sheet. This is data from the satellite GRACE, which measured the changes in mass in Greenland. It is stunning, and we are seeing huge changes. But again, we think the timescales for the decay of Greenland, we don't know whether it's centuries or millennia, but there's not much we can do to stop it. There are inertial forces involved that once the Greenland ice sheet starts to melt, we don't have the ability to stop it. And it's even more true for the much bigger ice mass in Antarctica. And the final aspect of climate change that has really long timescales is the energy system. I teach a course where I make my students design a low carbon energy system. And in that process, what they learn is that, in fact, the timescale for rebuilding the entire energy infrastructure of the world is likely to be a lot longer than some of the rhetoric you hear in politics. The discussion of saying, let's do it by 2030, let's decarbonize by 2040, even by 2050, is going to be an enormous challenge. This is just a perspective. This is a graph that shows what I think most people would see as good news. These are capacity additions in 2020. That is new electricity generating capacity in the US. And what you can see is that roughly 3/4 of new electricity generating capacity in the US that were planned, some of the stuff that was planned for December got pushed into 2021, but 75% was wind and solar. That's incredibly good news. But here's the bad news. At this rate of construction, it would still take us centuries to actually decarbonize our electric grid. Centuries. So we're talking about an acceleration in industrialization and rebuild of infrastructure like the world has never seen. It's like World War II for the US on steroids. What does that mean? Well, I think it's important to be honest as a scientist. You know, some people say we have to give people hope, and I am sympathetic to that, but I have an obligation as a scientist to describe the world as free from bias as possible. And so when I look at everything we understand about the climate system and about the energy system, I'd have to say that stabilizing greenhouse gas levels, either by changing behavior or changing technology, is possible, but we're not headed in that direction. It remains possible, and I think even highly likely, that global efforts will fall far short of what's required to prevent massive suffering by human societies and by the natural world. What does that mean? Well, here's a picture from 2012 in Illinois, an extreme heat wave in the US that caused extraordinary heat and drought conditions. We had a similar situation in Europe in 2003, in Russia in 2010. And in those situations, when heat waves and drought caused crop failures, unfortunately, the global food market didn't do a wonderful job. In many cases, instead of being a form of support where the world could compensate for shortages in any one place, markets tended to shut down. People tended to close borders, and that's a very dangerous thing. We actually need to think about becoming more globalized in this context. Of course, this is the fires in California. There were fires in Greece a few years ago. Here's the fires in Australia that were continental scale. Here's a hurricane it hit Houston. There's very good evidence that this was great. The size and duration of this storm was greatly exacerbated by climate change. And this is a picture of one of the major metropolitan areas in the United States completely underwater. Houston is still recovering from the damage from that one storm. They received over 70 inches of rain in some parts of Houston in just a few days. 70 inches, that's biblical. That is just incredible. Of course, this was Hurricane Sandy in New York, subway systems underwater. And this is a wonderful picture. It shows the Goldman Sachs building all lit up while all the other buildings are mostly dark. There's some lit up still, but mostly dark. What did Goldman Sachs do differently than everybody else? Some people thought this was a conspiracy, that Con Edison had a special contract with Goldman Sachs because of their power and money. It turns out that Goldman Sachs had put their backup generators on the 3rd floor. Most of the buildings in Lower Manhattan had backup generators, and they kept them in the basement, which turns out to be a really bad idea when there's a flood. So I think of this as the postcard of adaptation. Take another look at this. This is a picture of Hurricane Michael that came ashore in the Florida Panhandle and just destroyed a several mile section of homes. Just brutal, the destruction. And yet here is a house called the Sand Palace on 36th Street in Mexico Beach, Florida, that came through almost perfectly. You can even see the deck chairs that they put back out to enjoy the sun after the storm. But look at their neighbors. The houses are just gone. I think there's some interesting hope in this. I want to show you these 2 quotes, one from H.G. Wells, The Time Machine. We are kept keen on the grindstone of pain and necessity. And another one from Charles Darwin, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. And I actually think, as much as the global climate problem is an incredibly difficult problem because humans are tribal, nationalistic, we don't think collectively, we don't think very well about long timescales. What humans are really good at is dealing and adapting to difficult situations. So I'm not sure that we're going to solve the climate problem on the timescale that everybody hopes, but I do think we're going to be ingenious about adapting to it, because that's what humans are actually really, really good at. So for example, architecture. I think the 21st century is going to be the most innovative architectural century, maybe ever. Not because of our kind-heartedness, not because of our brilliance, but because climate change requires it. Similarly, I think we will develop new technology in agriculture and will be more innovative than ever before. Not because it's a good thing to do, it's because it's going to be actually required by the impacts of climate change. And the same with transportation and perhaps even government. And I do see some optimism in our ability to react to these changes. Now, how does this relate to the kind of problems that Walter talked about? How do we think about climate change? I think there is more and more, and there's more discussion about this in the community as well, both in the food community and the environmental community. There is a shared opportunity as we rebuild our energy infrastructure and as we rebuild all of these different systems in response to the demands of climate change. I think there's an opportunity for renewal and taking a new way forward. Maybe that involves a healthier, more equitable, and actually better society around the world. I just want to show you this picture, and I could show you other metrics like this. This is national vehicle miles traveled in the US. And what you can see, this is just goes through the beginning of 2020, but you can see the crash in vehicles miles traveled. You see it also with air passenger volumes. This is billion trips per month. And you can see it goes from about 700 at the beginning of the pandemic. And in just a few months, it crashes. This was an incredible change. I'm going to stop sharing slides and just wrap up right now. But basically, I think there's some interesting thing that happened here. In February of 2020, I knew all about the pandemic. Our colleague, Mark Lipsitch from the School of Public Health came and talked to the Center for the Environment all about what was happening in Singapore, what was happening in Wuhan. We knew about the pandemic. But if you had told me that we were going to shut down our university, we were going to shut down restaurants, and we were going to stay in our houses for the next 9-12 months, I would have said, no way, that's ridiculous. And yet, look what's happened. We've essentially shut our lives down. Incredible change driven by unexpected consequences. I kind of wonder if there's a little bit of hope there. I wonder if, as the reality of climate change gets worse and worse, as impacts build up, if at some point the kind of behavioral change we couldn't imagine happening last February will become the new reality. Right now, the kind of political will required to make the changes as quickly as we need them seems totally impossible. But maybe faced with real crisis, the impossible becomes necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schrag. There's lots of ground to cover there, and I'm sure we'll have time to talk about deeper about the environmental aspect. I'll hand it over to Laura now to share some insights from her years covering food insecurity in the US. Laura, please take it away.
Great, this is wonderful, fascinating. I'm glad you ended on such a positive note. I was feeling like I might need to lie down there for a little while, Dr. Schrag. So last February, my job was covering food labeling and disruptive tech in ag, kind of the full spectrum, some legislative things. In like March 10th, basically it all ground to a halt. And from that point forward, my job has been either supply chain disruption or food insecurity. Those have been the two big buckets that I've kind of drawn from for the past 11 months. And since I'm talking to a bunch of journalists, in terms of food insecurity, you can talk about the longstanding, in the US at least, the longstanding support systems that the government offers. So that's SNAP, that's WIC, that's the school lunch program. And those have all expanded and contracted and shifted slightly because of the pandemic. Then there have been pandemic specific programs that have emerged, some more successful than others. So we've had pandemic EBT, which is a debit card like system for all the kids who would have qualified for free and reduced price lunch and school meals. So basically, it's just money that gets sent to the homes of those food insecure families. And then there was this very Trumpian kind of project called the Families to Farmers or Farmers to Families Food Box Program, which was basically aimed at helping farmers, helping distributors, and food insecure people by kind of putting together these boxes at food banks. So I've covered kind of all of that. And I think that there's incredible fatigue. We're all tired of reading these stories. I mean, I think that for a long time, you saw story after story after story about the hospitality industry, which is pretty much the hardest hit, I think globally, but certainly in the United States. I mean, we've had at least 100,000 restaurants closed permanently. So let's just say very, very conservatively, that's more than 1 million people permanently out of those jobs, and there aren't that many. You can't pivot to another restaurant very easily. So, we've seen thousands of stories about hospitality workers and their trials and travails and food insecurity and et cetera. So I think for me right now, the challenge is how to find the news stories, the stories that haven't been told. And for both food insecurity and supply chain disruption, I find my work, and this is just maybe the way my quirky brain works, but it's always like the unexpected consequence of the pandemic. That's kind of what I feel like I'm chasing at this point. So things like, wait a second, where's all the movie theater popcorn? If we're not going to, where's that popcorn? Is it stockpiled somewhere? Or okay, if for Thanksgiving we're all going to be in much smaller households, where are those 20-pound turkeys that were in the pipeline, 9 months ago? So I've kind of spent a lot of time chasing those two things, but as much as I can in a quirky or unexpected way. So okay, what are industries that may be, decimated by the pandemic? How about birthday candle manufacturers? We're never going to have birthday candles on the top of a cake anymore. So what about the people that made those candles? So I think from a journalist perspective, it's how to find the as of yet untold stories, and then how to do it with grace and dignity. Because I mean, food insecurity, especially when you're talking about 50 million in the US alone, 50 million people food insecure, let's say 20 million of those kids, these are, there's a lot of shame associated with that. Many of these people are people who have never been food insecure in their lives, who've never relied on food assistance programs like SNAP and WIC, don't even know what those are. Often they've showed up at food banks around the country kind of sheepishly for the first time. So I've tried to tell a lot of those stories while allowing people their privacy and their dignity as much as possible. I think photographically, some of the best work in this arena that has been done, I think, has been very photographic. The New York Times had just an unbelievable photo-driven story a few weeks ago, kind of a multimedia story that was just pictures of people, food insecure people around the country. And I think it really spoke for itself. I also think that part of my job has been speaking for the underrepresented populations and those, for instance, farm workers. I've done a lot of stories on farm workers, so H-2A visa holders, but also the millions of undocumented farm workers we have in the United States, because they've been, as we've seen, especially vulnerable to COVID. Blacks and Hispanics and low-income people without health insurance, are frequently very vulnerable. And as Dr. Willett was saying, people who suffer from other lifestyle-related diseases, which is the irony. If you covered food insecurity 20 years ago or in other parts of the world, it's a lack of calories. And in the US right now, as it's increasingly becoming everywhere, it's not so much lack of calories, it's lack of nutrition. So we've got a preponderance of calories and not enough nutrition. So there's a little bit of a pivot there in how we're covering, this kind of thing. So I know we're a little bit lean on time. So I think if we can make the rest of this a little more, Q&A and open it up a little bit for dialogue, I think that might be a great way to spend the rest of our 10 minutes together.
Yes, definitely. We are running out of time. I think there's just so much to talk about. And Dr. Willett, I love your perspective on this. Laura mentioned that food insecurity is often a nutrition deficit, a problem. These are difficult times and people are struggling financially, which affects budget for grocery shopping and food expenses. In your opinion, is it possible to eat healthy despite the low budget? And as an active supporter of plant-based diets, would you say it's a more sustainable option, taking climate change into consideration? You're muted, Dr. Willett.
Great,
Yes.
thanks. Yes, thank you. A very important question. In principle, a more plant-based diet will be less expensive because meat is the most expensive part of most diets and some sort of high-end fish. So shifting toward a healthier plant-based diet can be less expensive. But for a lot of people, it's not so simple because they're not used to preparing it. Although I should add that in most traditional diets, the predominance of foods are more plant-based than in current American diets. So for some people, it's going back to traditions that they or their parents or grandparents know quite a bit about and know about how to make those diets wonderfully flavorful and enjoyable. But for so many people, that's been lost. And those traditions of how to prepare healthy, enjoyable this is not necessarily strictly vegetarian, but predominantly plant-based, or we're calling it plant-forward diets. So a lot of this is both knowledge of how to do it, sometimes access to foods, although in many cases these foods are more stable one of the reasons they're less expensive is that it costs a lot to keep a side of beef refrigerated, taking it across the country, but you can move a bag of beans across the country without too much, without any refrigeration at all. So I think taking advantage of our knowledge about what's healthier and helping people who are stressed, food insecure, improve the quality of their diets, moving in this direction is something where we need to spend some more time and effort. The current amount, I should also say that having SNAP and these food assistance programs has been enormously beneficial. It's hard to imagine what it would be without them. But even before the pandemic, they were not providing good nutrition. They were still mostly paying for unhealthy foods, sugar sweetened beverages, refined starches, processed meats. So even before the pandemic came along, there was real need to improve SNAP to make it both supportive of a satisfying, affordable diet, but also make it healthier. We could see it was really contributing to the disparities in obesity, diabetes, and all the consequences downstream. And the need for improving the quality has gotten even greater. Interestingly, the same department, USDA, does provide the WIC program, which does have that built-in education experience and emphasis on healthy foods. It's a much smaller program, but that actually works quite well. It's for women who are pregnant or recently post-pregnant and their children. So there is knowledge about how to do that. And we need to expand that into SNAP. And in some ways, it's the sort of nutritional version of Build Back Better.
So if I could add one thing to what Dr. Willett has just said.
Sure.
So the SNAP assistance has always been predicated on this thing called the Thrifty Food Plan. That's what dictates the amount of money given. And it really is kind of a 1950s housewife kind of perspective on how much time we have to prepare food. So it's very much, in a dual working household or a single parent household, frequently time is of the essence. And so I think that moving forward, we're going to have to re-envision healthy foods that are not, cooked all day beans, those kinds of things. And I think that we're going to see that partly because we've had this pivot in the pandemic to online benefit use. So which removes any invisibility or anonymity. You can see precisely what people have chosen. And I think that historically, at least in the US, the very far right and the very far left agree that they don't want to circumscribe what low income people can buy with their benefits, that it's a food sovereignty issue. And I think that's going to change as we see precisely what people on SNAP benefits are selecting with their online benefits. I think that there'll be a revisitation of whether we can more narrowly dictate what's available by these benefits.
Laura, I have to jump in just for a second because I find there's incredible hypocrisy in this whole area. And Walter and I have talked about this. The idea that we should protect SNAP recipients' freedom to buy candy or sugar sweetened beverages, whereas we have no problem telling WIC recipients, women, infant, and children, exactly what to buy. They can buy this type of milk, they can buy this type of vegetables. I find that unbelievably condescending to women, infant, and children. I think we have to look at the roots of this, which partly involve corruption. Why is Pepsi, Cola, and Mars Corporation giving money to the NAACP? I actually think there's a problem there. I think there's huge influence of corporate donations from candy and sugar sweetened beverage. And I suspect Walter would probably agree with me.
Absolutely. There's deep corruption, and a lot of the support for so-called hunger advocates comes from those corporations. So, and it's undermining health. It really does require a deep look at this to make it respectable for the participants in a way that it doesn't undermine health, because we can see exactly what's happened. You could say 20 years ago we didn't understand the nutrition and all the consequences of eating these different foods, but now it's crystal clear.
Look at the fight that happened in New York City when Mayor Bloomberg tried to ban sugar sweetened beverages. You can see the people coming out of the woodwork who are really financing this.
Yeah, I want to jump in there. So we are a bit lean on time. I think we've barely scratched the surface here with everything. We'll take one question from the audience. I believe Lex Talamo has a question. Lex, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question directly. And if everyone is okay, we'll go maybe continue the discussion for another 15 minutes, if that works for our speakers. I think there's more we can touch on. Is Lex available? Okay. While Lex prepares to ask a question, I just wanted to throw it out there, and maybe for Dr. Schrag, as we are still addressing these policies and programs, the US is rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. Dr. Schrag, you've written on that, the importance of that. How do you think the food industry will be affected by these new changes in climate-related policies?
So I think directly, the food industry is not going to be affected in the near future. Although I think there is growing awareness of a market for things like meat alternatives and a variety of other things. I mean, Laura, I'm sure, has written much about that trend, and that's an interesting one to see how that develops. For me, when Burger King started serving the meatless Whopper, that was a real sign of change. I haven't kept up with how they've done, but I think it's an interesting change. I think if you put enough tomato and mayonnaise and stuff on a burger, you probably don't taste what's between the bun anymore anyway, but that's a separate issue. I think one of the interesting things will be the policies that affect agriculture in the US. And for example, there was a question Ben asked from the audience about how to encourage farmers to transition towards this. And I think it's interesting. I personally am very skeptical about integrating agriculture and forestry into carbon pricing regimes that involve energy, because of the potential for massive cheating and problems with additionality and permanence and all sorts of other things. But I think some of these changes are really important. So the question is, how do we get farmers to change the way they farm, to reduce the tillage and a variety of other things? And I think one of the interesting things the Biden administration is doing is targeting some funds that Congress set aside for farmers anyway because of the trade war with China. There was a $30 billion fund, and President Biden is, I think, at least reportedly, trying to repurpose that instead of just generically providing them with support, to actually target it for people to actually incentivize changing behavior. I think that's a very clever thing. That's not money that's going anywhere else. That's money that Congress has allocated to farmers. So let's actually use it to encourage farmers to do things that are good for the climate too. I think that's an example of the kind of smart way to do policy, I think.
Yeah, I think I was on a call this morning with Senator Stabenow about precisely this. So the CCC is definitely being considered to fund some kind of carbon credit and also a methane program. So because methane reduction with ranching and dairy is clearly a priority as well for the Biden administration and for
I see Nancy
for
wants
Secretary
to
Vilsack. Yeah.
Go ahead, Nancy, you got to unmute yourself.
Thank you.
Yes, Nancy.
I've been dying to do this since Dr. Schrag made his presentation. A while ago, I represented two different countries. One was both of them involved with carbon credits. One sold the credits because, and one was a purchaser of it because they were a massive country that did a great deal of pollution. And the other was a small country that was very, very green, but very poor. And as a humanitarian perspective, it's always bothered me because, and activated me, because what you see is the repression of development. So these carbon credits seem to me to be very double-sworded. They might help the environment, but they certainly are a disservice to society. What is your feeling about that? Do you think there's any value to them? And if there is, how can you mitigate this imbalance?
So I think there is a broader question here, Nancy, which is how do the developed countries of the world, led by the US and actually now by China too, because China's Belt and Road program is potentially incredibly important in this regard. How do the richer countries of the world actually engage with the rest of the world on environmental issues, on nutrition issues, on health issues more generally, and on poverty issues and development? It is the age-old question of sustainable development and whether it is just a vision or whether it can be a reality. And I personally think, for example, far more important than just rejoining the Paris Agreement, I think the most important thing the US could do, and hasn't announced it yet, but I would love to see, for example, President Biden joining with China, perhaps with the EU too, and committing to a massive financing program to actually finance the world's change in infrastructure. This is not foreign aid. This is not giving money to poor countries to build energy infrastructure. It's providing the financing. We're gonna make money on this. We're gonna let banks make money on this, but it requires a system just like the Belt and Road Initiative from President Xi of using organizations like the Chinese Development Bank. And we have set up a new international development bank in the US as well in the Trump administration. It just hasn't been used very effectively. And we could see the use of those institutions to finance clean energy development around the world. And the question is, what are then the mechanisms for financing the kind of changes in agriculture, the changes in food distribution systems as well? And that's a very interesting question. I don't think we've scratched the surface on this, but I know Walter's thought about this a lot. He's done a lot of work internationally. Maybe you want to jump in, Walter.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a huge question, and Dan and I have been bouncing this back and forth. We're going to be having some more meetings about this very topic because you can see it potentially going in a bad direction. It's a greenwash and a fake, and therefore damaging. But is there a way to do it right? And I think that's what Nancy is asking for here. And there's so many ways to do it wrong. Can we find a pathway to do it right? And to me, that's something that deserves bringing all the players around the table and really deeply thinking about how to come up with the best strategies. I do believe there is a potential for fostering development and sequestering carbon through the agricultural system, but it has to be done carefully and monitored. I'm not sure we know exactly how to do that, how to set that up at this point in time. Again, we can see lots of ways of doing it badly.
Yeah, Laura, you have been covering food insecurity and the deficits in the US supply chain, even before the pandemic shed new light on the problem. As a journalist, what would you say are some of the conflicts that often arise when covering this topic, and how have you addressed them? I know you talked about the shame and the embarrassment. Are there other things that you take into consideration you've been confronted with in your coverage?
Well, I think food insecurity for decades in the US has been considered an urban problem, and the pandemic has in some ways revealed that it's much more widespread. And in fact, the kind of hollowing out of rural America has contributed to a lot of desperation in those areas. Places where, you'll have miles and miles of road between dollar stores, so there's not a legit grocery store. So you have these, significant problems without the infrastructure of food assistance that a lot of urban places have. And then increasingly, it's also an elderly problem in the US. And a lot of the programs in the Trump administration, a lot of the programs that are specifically geared towards, public-private kind of Meals on Wheels type programs, suffered some indignities and some cuts here and there that left older Americans fairly vulnerable. So I think that those things have been revealed. I will say that the early part of the pandemic, I think all of us, because we didn't know how this was going to play out, had this like Mad Max vision of, what we're going to all be in our little weird compounds with, whatever. We all had these worst case scenarios. And I think that it did reveal that our food system, while incredibly flawed, bent without breaking. And, I think moving forward, we all have a keener understanding that big meat companies with massive processing facilities are probably a bad idea because they bottleneck and fall apart. And it's having all of these local and regional food systems and redundancies that have allowed grocery store shelves to refill and for people to kind of not get hysterical about shortfalls. So I think that it's called it's shown a really strong light on some of the good things about our food system and on where we should put our efforts moving forward. And I think certainly with local food systems, they've stepped in to fill some of the void, and hopefully we can from a federal and legislative perspective remunerate those smaller or regional or local farmers and younger farmers and farmers of color in a way that we historically have done to the kind of the big white row crop farmers in the Midwest.
Thank you, Laura. I think we have time for a couple of questions. There's a question from Paula Huss. I don't know if Dr. Schrag can take this. A comment on the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, and what is working on perennial grains.
Yeah, perennial grains is a really interesting idea. The benefit of perennial grains is you don't till. And if you don't till, it means that the soil carbon over time can actually increase in total carbon stored. And if we did this in huge areas, it would actually matter a lot. Not a lot, to put it in perspective, it's still a small fraction of everything that we need to do in terms of changing our energy system. It doesn't allow us to keep burning fossil fuels, but it would certainly be a worthwhile thing to do. Storing carbon in soils is a vulnerable thing because if you till it once, it can return, a lot of it goes right back. So it's not a great place to store carbon for the long run, but it's still a useful thing to do. My understanding, and it's limited, is that the work on perennial grains is interesting, but is currently still, the yields are a tiny fraction of what, or at least much, much lower than the sort of yields you get from corn or wheat, from annual crops. And that means that competing in the market is going to be tough. It is important to remember that taste is actually not that big a deal because most of the grain goes to animal feed. So what you really care about is calories per acre as well as cost, right? So it's, I guess, cost per calorie is really what you care about. But for right now, I think it's really important that research continues, but I wonder, I think it's not quite ready yet. Walter may have some other insights.
Yeah, I think I agree with Dan that this is something that really does deserve investment in research. We've spent decades and vast amount of monies ramping up the yield of corn and wheat. And so there is a lot of potential there for continued yield production. But the big point, as Dan mentioned, is that we feed the very large majority of our grains to animals. And if we could do one thing, it would be stop feeding grain to animals and eat the grains ourselves in a non-refined way. That would have make massive improvements in health and environment at the same time. We do put quite a bit of grain into biofuels, ethanol production at the moment, and that's worth discussing further too, pluses and minuses of that. But from a health standpoint and an environmental standpoint, if I could do one thing, it would be to not continue feeding grain to animals. There's just such inefficient conversion and a lot of greenhouse gas production, and people would be healthier eating the grains rather than the animals. So if we do that, then yield is not so really important. You could have a 50% reduction in yield and actually need to grow less grains if we weren't running them through animals.
And I think Lex has a question tied to that with meat packing outbreaks and COVID-19. Looking at the environmental aspect, what do you see as the future of animal agriculture, and speaking mainly to developed countries? If any of you would like to take that.
I certainly, oh, go ahead.
Okay, maybe I was going to just add a bit. I think we're going to see huge changes that the Impossible Burger and Beyond Burger kind of substitutes have made a splash, still are expensive, not for the average person every day yet, but in principle, you can produce plant-based burgers, and not just burgers, but all kinds of plant products like meat with animal-based, you can place animal-based products with plant-based products. For example, one company in China has come up with a plant-based alternative to pork, and it fits with a lot of Chinese dishes because it's not big slices of meat. It's sort of ground kind of product, and apparently it's really taking off in China. It can be produced much less expensively and without all the waste, contamination that goes along with pork production, without all the antibiotic resistance. So there's huge benefits besides being healthier, cheaper, less environmentally destructive, less microbial resistance, just huge advantages there. Also on the milk side too, that there are now lots and lots of different milk alternatives too, that have no saturated fat or very low saturated fat, fewer calories, cost less, less environmental footprint. So there's that coming along. And then there's these cultured meat products that are very expensive. Until recently, they're down to about 10 times the cost of the actual animal-based piece of meat. But people in that industry say they will be cost competitive within 10 years. So this is, you can basically have, it is real meat, but it's just produced without the animal in basically a big Petri dish. And I think that, again, you circumvent lots of problems by doing that. It probably won't be any healthier than the red meat, which is not a good thing. So I still wouldn't advise consuming. We'll have to study it more, but I think on the health side, these are not going to be a benefit, but there's all kinds of other benefits. So we are going to, I think, see big transformations in this area for lots of reasons.
Laura, your take?
Yeah, so I wrote a story yesterday about the world's first 3D printed ribeye. So this is coming. There are 70 companies around the world doing these cultured meat products. And later in 2021, we're going to see the launch of several of them into the marketplace. And Dr. Willett's right, cost parity is going to take some time. But going back to plant-based, the pandemic has supercharged that phenomenon. Something we thought maybe 18 months ago was a fad, it's here to stay. And I think that the early adopters have been millennials and Gen Z who've grown up with the specter of climate change. So these are not vegans looking for the next thing. These are omnivores who are willing to make a small shift, a small sacrifice in their diet, especially if there's really strong verisimilitude in terms of, does it taste almost like meat? So we're going to see those get better and better. And I also think that as the connection to real meat is more tenuous, we'll also see improvements nutritionally in those products, that they can be made more nutritiously. Incrementally, we'll see those shifts so that it's a little less fat or a little less sodium, or those things will be brought to bear. So I think that these are here to stay, and they will make huge inroads in traditional animal ag.
Thank you, Laura. I have one question for our panelists, and I'm going to start with Dr. Schrag. To close us off, how can pandemic lessons be incorporated into improving food security resilience in your view? I know you did talk about, you talked about hope and what we can achieve. So in your opinion, what are some of the lessons that can help us improve on this situation?
I think one of the lessons, as I said before, one of the lessons is just that we are capable of extraordinary change when required. It's a reminder of the ingenuity and incredible adaptive nature of human beings. But I do think we have to pay attention to international institutions. I think one of the great failings of the pandemic, and it hasn't gotten enough attention, is how different countries were essentially affected quite differently by the pandemic because of different levels of capacity and different. And I think there's a really interesting question about how the buildup of international institutions could help that. I'll tell you something really radical, which is I think climate change, as well as many other global issues, including global food security, I think we need to rethink the UN. I think the UN is built up, we had the League of Nations that came out of World War I that never really took off. And then World War II gave us the UN, and it was really designed to prevent another world war. Well, we have other global challenges right now. And certainly we still want to prevent another global world war. But I think we need to think about global governance in a very new way. From the International Criminal Court all the way to food security and climate change. And I think the current structures are not adequate for the challenges ahead. I think that they're going to demand a whole new system of global governance. It'll be very interesting to see how that evolves.
Thank you so much. Dr. Willett?
Right, I would agree that there are going to be changes, but I think we are in a fork in the road. We could go on to a future that is built back with better institutions, better programs that would be carefully science-based. But the fork in the road is that it's sort of a small group of people take advantage of them and leave everybody else behind. And I think we came very close to going down one of those forks, different fork. And I think we're going down now in this country just within the past few weeks. But you look at the globe, there's countries are teetering on that because we see very often that when things get scarcity, things get difficult, people with power grab onto more and protect their power and resources and leave other people out. So that applies within countries and between countries as well. So I agree with the need, as Dr. Schrag mentioned, to look at this globally. And the pandemic has pointed out, and in a way, the climate change issue too, that it's narrow-minded and it's not in our self-interest to look at this. Just grab onto what you can, because the virus, if we don't control it globally, it will come back in different forms and bite us. And the same with climate change and other environmental issues as well. We are in many ways in a common ship here, and just grabbing the best cabin isn't necessarily the way to keep afloat.
Great. Laura?
Well, so very briefly, I think that the farm subsidy system in this country this year showed us that it's broken and that we need to rethink it. It forces us to lose sight of what's important. So in 2020, we handed out taxpayer dollars to the tune of $46 billion to farmers, whether that was trade mitigation money or pandemic bailout money. And it really forces the food system to skew in such a way that we have so many empty calories, subsidized calories that are cheap. And that's a direct responsibility, the cause of obesity really is this farm subsidy system.
Thank you so much. Please help me in thanking our fantastic panel for their time. We went a bit over. I think we barely scratched the surface. There's just so much to talk about. Thank you so much to each of you. Thank you to the AFPC-USA for hosting this session. And also thank you to our audience who stuck with us for an hour, 20 minutes. I hope we have the opportunity to continue this discussion. Is a very important one on the future of food. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you so